Commander Vexthul's massive form filled the interrogation chair, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the harsh tribunal lights. The fallen warrior's 6 eyes darted nervously between the recording device and the small Altarian translator, seated across from him. Each of his forearms bore the ritual scars of a Corvani fleet commander, marking victories in dozens of conquered worlds. But today, those same arms trembled with something the proud warrior race had never known before. Humanity entered their lives, fear. "State your designation and rank for the record," Plix requested, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of the neural interface translator. The young Altarian's blue-scaled hands moved quickly across the holographic controls, adjusting the psychic dampeners that would prevent Vexthul from influencing the testimony. "Commander Vexthul, 3rd Fleet, Corvani Imperial Navy. Serial designation Warrior Prime 7749, veteran of the..." He paused, his mandibles clicking in what humans might recognize as nervous habit. "Veteran of the human war." The weight of those words seemed to crush the air from the chamber. Even the tribunal's automated systems registered the drop in atmospheric pressure as Vexthul's massive lung sacs contracted. 3 decades had passed since the war's end, but the nightmares still came every sleep cycle. Images of burning ships, of impossible human tactics, of warriors who fought on even as their bodies failed them. "You understand this testimony is being recorded for the Galactic Historical Archive?" Plix asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Your account will be preserved for future generations to study." "Good," Vexthul replied, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "Let them study, let them learn. Perhaps they will be wiser than we were." Across the galaxy, on a small blue planet that had once been dismissed as barely worth conquering, humans went about their daily routines. Office workers hurried to catch transport tubes in New Tokyo. Farmers tended crops. In the rebuilt agricultural zones of former New Seoul, children played in parks that had once been battlefields. They lived their lives in peaceful ignorance of the terror their species had struck into the hearts of would-be conquerors throughout the galaxy. The Corvani Empire had ruled 17 star systems before they encountered humanity. Their military doctrine was simple and brutally effective. Overwhelming force applied swiftly to break enemy morale. It had worked on the crystalline Vorthak, whose warrior castes shattered like glass under orbital bombardment. It had crushed the hive-minded Zellan, whose queens surrendered when faced with the destruction of their breeding worlds. It had even broken the proud Altarians, who valued individual life too highly to sacrifice entire populations for victory. "Tell, curious about your first encounter with human forces," Plix prompted, his translator's training keeping his voice professionally neutral despite the historical significance of the moment. Vexthul's mandibles clicked again, a sound that had once struck fear into the hearts of enemy soldiers. Now it seemed more like the chattering of a frightened insect. "We thought we were facing primitives. By the great swarm, how wrong we were." The commander's 6 eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the chamber walls, seeing not the sterile tribunal room, but the bridge of his flagship, the inevitable conquest, as it had appeared 33 years ago. The tactical displays had shown a simple target, a single human colony world designated in their files as New Seoul. Intelligence reports suggested a population of perhaps 2 million farmers and miners with minimal defensive capabilities. It should have been a routine conquest, the kind of easy victory that padded a commander's reputation. "The intelligence was correct in a way," Vexthul continued, his voice growing distant. "They were farmers and miners, families who had left their home planet to build new lives on a frontier world. They had no standing army, no orbital defense platforms, no military fleet. By every measure our strategists used, they were defenseless. But the Corvani strategists had never encountered humans before. They had studied dozens of species, catalogued their military capabilities, their psychological profiles, their breaking points. They knew exactly how much pressure to apply to shatter enemy resistance. They had never met a species that grew, stronger under pressure, that turned desperation into fury, that treated impossible odds as just another problem to solve. "The colony's leader was a human they called Captain Do-hyun," Vexthul said, and even now, decades later, the name carried weight. He was nothing special to look at by human standards. Average height, brown hair, calm demeanor. He wore simple work clothes and carried himself like a man who had spent his life solving practical problems. The commander's voice took on an almost respectful tone. When our advanced scouts observed the colony, they reported that this Du Hyun spent his days inspecting farming equipment and reviewing mining operations. He seemed more concerned with crop yields than military preparations. Our xenopsychologists assured us he would surrender within hours of our arrival. But when our forces landed expecting quick surrender, Captain Do Hyun turned that peaceful colony into our nightmare. The memory still burned bright in Vexthul's mind. The way the human had stood on the colony's main platform, watching the Corvani dropships descend like metal thunderclouds. There had been no panic in his posture, no desperate scrambling for weapons. Instead, Do Hyun had simply nodded once as if confirming some internal calculation, and then spoken a single word into his communicator. That word had been harvest. Within minutes, the entire colony had transformed. The peaceful farmers became guerrilla fighters. The mining equipment became weapons of war. The very ground beneath the Corvani forces became a weapon as carefully placed explosives turned landing zones into craters. And through it all, Captain Do Hyun had orchestrated the chaos with the same calm efficiency he had once applied to crop rotations. We lost more soldiers in the first hour of that operation than we had in the previous 3 conquests combined, Vexthul admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. And that was when we began to understand the terrible truth about humans. They don't just fight to win. They fight like the continuation of their species depends on every single battle. The massive Corvani warfleet had arrived at New Seoul like a storm of metal and plasma, their ships blotting out the colony's twin suns. Commander Vexthul had watched from his flagship's bridge as the first wave of orbital strikes lit up the planet's surface like deadly fireworks. Standard conquest protocols demanded the destruction of all military installations first, followed by key infrastructure targets that would break the enemy's will to fight. We followed the same playbook that had worked on 47 other worlds, Vexthul told the tribunal, his 6 eyes distant with memory. Precision strikes on power plants, communication hubs, transportation networks. Within 6 hours, any civilized species would be begging for terms. But Captain Do Hyun had spent years preparing for this moment. The mining colony's extensive tunnel networks hadn't been built just for extracting ore. They were a massive underground fortress system. Every major building had hidden passages leading deep into the planet's crust. Emergency bunkers, stocked, with months of supplies lay scattered throughout the underground maze. Within hours, our communications were jammed by improvised human devices, Vexthul recalled, his voice growing distant as he remembered the first signs that something was terribly wrong. The jamming wasn't random interference, it was surgical, cutting off specific command frequencies while leaving others open. The humans were listening to Corvani tactical chatter, learning their attack patterns in real time. Major Korthven had led the first ground assault, confident that his armored divisions would crush any remaining resistance. Instead, his convoy found empty streets and abandoned buildings. The colonists had simply vanished, leaving behind what appeared to be a ghost town. That's when the real nightmare began. Our supply lines were cut by explosive traps that seemed to appear from nowhere, Vexthul continued. Bridges that had been intact 1 hour would be smoking craters the next. Supply convoys would disappear entirely, leaving only scorch marks on the road. Lieutenant Haya Jin had been the colony's chief mining engineer before the invasion. She knew every tunnel, every maintenance shaft, every hidden passage in the underground network. More importantly, she understood explosives better than most. Corvani demolition experts. While the alien forces searched empty buildings above ground, Hye Jin was turning the colony's industrial infrastructure into weapons of war. The mining charges she had used for blasting ore became devastating improvised bombs. A single detonation could collapse an entire city block, burying Corvani soldiers under tons of rubble. Construction mechs designed for building roads and structures were retrofitted with armor plating and weapon mounts, becoming crude but effective. Tanks that emerged from hidden garage tunnels to ambush enemy patrols. Even their farming equipment became deadly, Vexthul remembered with something approaching admiration. Agricultural drones that once sprayed crops with fertilizer now dropped explosive packages on our positions. Harvest machines designed to cut grain turned into mobile weapons platforms that could slice through our battle armor. The Corvani had expected to face desperate refugees hiding in caves. Instead, they found themselves fighting an entire population that had transformed their peaceful world into a death trap. Every building contained hidden firing positions. Every street intersection was mined with explosives that could be triggered remotely. Even the colony's weather control system was weaponized, creating sudden storms that grounded Corvani aircraft. We lost 3 entire platoons in the first week, Vexthul continued, his voice heavy with the weight of those losses. Not to superior firepower or advanced technology, but to human ingenuity. They turned their entire world into a weapon against us. The breakthrough came when Sergeant Tae-min, a former construction foreman, led a desperate mission to capture a Corvani dropship that had been forced down by surface-to-air missiles, improvised from mining equipment. Instead of trying to escape the planet or use the ship for evacuation, Tae-min and his team did something the Corvani had never seen before. They studied it. Working in hidden workshops deep underground, human engineers and mechanics tore the alien craft apart bolt by bolt. They analyzed the power systems, mapped the weapon configurations, and reverse-engineered the propulsion technology. Within days, they had created crude but functional copies using salvaged materials and jury-rigged components. That's when we realized these weren't just farmers and miners. Vexthul's voice cracked with the memory. These were humans. And humans don't just fight, they adapt, they learn. They become whatever they need to become to survive. The first human-built fighter craft was little more than a mining pod with rocket engines and improvised weapons bolted to its hull. It looked like scrap metal compared to sleek Corvani interceptors, but when pilot Min Jun took it into combat, the results shocked both sides. The crude fighter was faster than expected, more maneuverable than its appearance suggested, and absolutely fearless in combat. Soon, entire squadrons of improvised human aircraft were rising from hidden launch sites throughout the colony. They couldn't match Corvani ships in direct combat, but they didn't need to. They used hit-and-run tactics, striking fast and disappearing back into underground hangars before the enemy could respond. Captain Do-Yun coordinated the resistance from a mobile command center that moved through the tunnel network, always staying one step ahead of Corvani search teams. His tactical brilliance wasn't just in knowing when to fight, it was in knowing when to vanish completely, making the enemy waste resources searching empty tunnels while the real attack came from an unexpected direction. The siege of New Seoul lasted 6 months. Each day brought new innovations from the human defenders, new ways to turn civilian technology into military assets. By the end, the Corvani had lost more ships and soldiers than in any previous conquest, while the humans had built an underground civilization that could wage war indefinitely, and Do-Yun's resistance had sent a message across human space that reached every colony, every outpost, every settlement where Earth's children had made their homes. The message was simple but terrifying to anyone who heard it. Earth's children would not go quietly into the night. The defeat at New Seoul had shaken the Corvani High Command to its core. For the first time in their empire's history, a simple colony world had held out for 6 months against their finest troops. Emergency strategy sessions ran for days as military leaders tried to understand what had gone wrong. The solution they reached was brutally simple. If they couldn't conquer human worlds directly, they would starve them into submission. After New Seoul, Command decided on a different approach, Vexthul explained to the tribunal, his mandibles clicking with nervous energy. If we couldn't take human worlds easily, we would cut off their supply lines. No fuel, no food shipments, no reinforcements. Let them wither on their isolated planets. The target was obvious. Titan Station, humanity's primary fuel processing facility in the outer solar system. The massive space station orbited Saturn's largest moon, converting raw materials from the gas giant's rings into the exotic matter that powered human starships. Cut that lifeline, and the entire human fleet would be grounded within months. Intelligence reports painted an encouraging picture for the Corvani strategists. Titan Station was a civilian facility, designed for industrial operations rather than military defense. Its garrison consisted of maybe 50 security personnel under the command of someone called Commander So Young, a former Earth Defense Force officer who had been assigned to what was essentially a desk job overseeing fuel production quotas. "We brought the entire 4th Battle Group," Vexthul recalled, his voice carrying the confidence that had filled Corvani command chambers before the operation. 15 heavy cruisers, 40 destroyers, and 2 dreadnoughts. The inevitable victory. Herself served as Admiral Korthvin's flagship, 2 kilometers of armored death, carrying enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. The fleet that assembled for the attack represented the cream of Corvani military technology. Each heavy cruiser carried a crew of 3,000 warriors, their hulls bristling with plasma cannons and torpedo tubes. The destroyers were built for speed and precision strikes, capable of dancing between enemy formations while delivering devastating barrages. And the dreadnoughts, the massive capital ships, were mobile fortresses that had never been defeated in open combat. Against this armada stood a single industrial station with perhaps 50 defenders. But Commander So Young had spent her entire career preparing for impossible situations. Her service record showed deployments to frontier worlds where Earth Defense Force units had held off pirate fleets 10 times their size through clever tactics and sheer determination. She had studied every major space battle in human history, learning from victories and defeats alike. Most importantly, she understood something about human nature that the Corvani had yet to grasp. When cornered, humans didn't surrender. They got creative. As the 4th Battle Group approached Titan Station, long-range sensors showed exactly what the Corvani expected to see. The station's defensive systems powered down one by one. Communication arrays went silent. Even the massive industrial reactors that kept the facility running began shutting down in sequence. Every indication suggested that So Young had recognized the hopelessness of her situation and was preparing to surrender. The station appeared to power down completely, Vexthul remembered. It was broadcasting surrender signals on all frequencies. Admiral Korthvin was pleased. Finally, humans who understood the futility of resistance. The Corvani commander ordered his ships into close formation for boarding operations. Standard doctrine called for the heavy cruisers to dock directly with the station, while destroyers provided perimeter security. It was a textbook operation they had performed dozens of times on other worlds, efficient and professional. "That was our mistake," Vexthul whispered, his 6 eyes focusing on something far beyond the tribunal chamber. So Young had converted the entire fuel depot into a massive explosive device, but she didn't detonate it immediately. She waited. The human commander had turned Titan Station into the largest bomb in the solar system. Months of careful preparation had gone into the trap, rerouting fuel lines, installing hidden detonators, creating a chain reaction that would consume the entire facility in seconds. But the genius of her plan wasn't just the explosive power, it was the timing. So Young allowed the Corvani fleet to approach, to feel secure in their victory. She watched through external cameras as the first heavy cruisers extended their docking tubes as boarding parties prepared to storm what they thought was a defeated station. Half the 4th Battle Group had committed to docking procedures, their ships locked in position with no room to maneuver quickly. That's when she triggered the trap. The explosion that consumed Titan Station was visible from Earth, a new star that burned in Saturn's sky for 3 full minutes. The blast vaporized 12 Corvani ships instantly, their hulls torn apart by forces that no armor could withstand. 5 more vessels were crippled by the shockwave, their engines dead and weapons systems offline, drifting helplessly in the debris, field that had once been humanity's largest fuel depot. But Commander So Young's real masterpiece wasn't the explosion itself. It was what came next. From hidden positions throughout the asteroid belt, human fighters emerged like angry wasps from a disturbed nest. Pilot Boram led the first squadron, her converted mining ship barely larger than a Corvani shuttle, but packed with improvised missiles cobbled together from industrial explosives and guidance systems salvaged from construction drones. They came, out of nowhere, Vexthul continued, his voice rising with remembered panic. Our sensors showed empty space one moment, then suddenly the void was full of tiny ships moving faster than anything that small had a right to move. Engineer Jun Seo had spent months modifying human EVA suits into single-person attack craft. Each suit was essentially a flying torpedo, equipped with just enough life support to keep a pilot alive for a few hours and enough explosive power to cripple a capital ship's engines. They were nearly invisible to Corvani sensors, too small and cold to register as threats until they were already inside the fleet's defensive perimeter. They swarmed us like insects, Vexthul remembered. Our point defense systems were designed to stop missiles and fighters, not individual humans flying modified spacesuits. They slipped through our defensive fire like ghosts. The human pilots showed a level of tactical coordination that shouldn't have been possible for such improvised forces. They targeted specific systems, engine housings, weapon mounts, sensor arrays with surgical precision. When Boram's squadron exhausted their missiles, they didn't retreat. Instead, they rammed their ships directly into Corvani vessels, using their own craft as guided weapons. And these humans, Vexthul's voice cracked with the memory, they rammed their tiny ships into our engines, our weapons systems, anywhere they could cause maximum damage. They turned themselves into living missiles. The Battle of Titan Station lasted only 4 hours, but those 4 hours rewrote Corvani understanding of human warfare. By the time the surviving ships of the 4th Battle Group limped away from Saturn's orbit, they had lost 17 vessels and over 30,000 crew members. The humans had sacrificed a single space station and perhaps 200 defenders to achieve a victory that military historians would study for generations. But the moment that haunted Vexthul's dreams wasn't the explosion, or the swarm attacks, or even the kamikaze runs. It was the final transmission from Commander So Young as Titan Station tore itself apart around her. The worst part, Vexthul added quietly, was the recording she transmitted as the station exploded. She was laughing. In the face of certain death surrounded by the flames of her own making, the human was laughing. In that laughter, the Corvani had heard something that chilled them more than any battle scream or death threat. They had heard joy, the sound of a human who had achieved exactly what she set out to do, regardless of the personal cost. The destruction of the 4th Battle Group at Titan Station had sent shockwaves through the Corvani Empire. News of the defeat spread like wildfire through their military networks, reaching every corner of their 17 conquered star systems. For the first time in their history, the mighty Corvani war machine had been stopped, not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by the sheer determination of a species they had dismissed as primitives. A high command was furious after Titan Station, Vexthul explained to the tribunal, his 6 eyes reflecting the harsh lights of the chamber. The Emperor himself called for blood. They decided to strike at Earth itself, to show the humans the price of resistance and crush their spirit once and for all. The plan was simple in its brutality. No more surgical strikes on isolated colonies or supply stations. This time the Corvani would target the heart of human civilization itself. Seoul Metroplex, the sprawling mega-city that housed 40 million humans and served as the center of Earth's military-industrial complex, would be reduced to rubble. The message would be clear: resist the Corvani Empire, and your homeworld burns. Supreme Admiral Zethmore, veteran of 30 successful planetary conquests, was given command of the largest invasion force ever assembled by the Corvani military. The entire First Fleet, 200 warships including 5 massive dreadnoughts, each one capable of glassing continents. Transport vessels carried 500,000 elite troops, supported by mechanized divisions and orbital assault platforms. That could level cities from space. We brought everything, Vexthul remembered with grim satisfaction. The cream of our military might, weapons that had broken the resistance of entire star systems. Against one planet, even one as defended as Earth, victory seemed assured. But Earth's defenders had been preparing for this moment since the first reports of Corvani aggression reached human space. General Wubin, Earth's supreme military commander, was a veteran of the Mars colonial wars and the Europa mining conflicts. He had studied every human military victory and defeat from the past century, learning lessons that would prove invaluable in the coming battle. The planet's surface looked normal to Corvani orbital reconnaissance: cities, industrial complexes, military bases arranged in predictable patterns. What their sensors couldn't detect were the massive underground networks that General Wubin had spent 2 years constructing. The entire planet had been honeycombed with tunnels, bunkers, and hidden factories, powered by geothermal systems that produced no electromagnetic signature visible from space. "We began with standard orbital bombardment," Vex Thul recalled, his voice taking on the mechanical tone of a military report. "For 3 days and nights, we pounded their cities, their military bases, everything that looked like a strategic target. The sky over Seoul burned like a second sun as our plasma cannons turned concrete and steel into molten slag. From orbit, the bombardment appeared devastatingly effective. Entire city blocks disappeared under waves of superheated energy. Military installations vanished in mushroom clouds that could be seen from space. By the 3rd day, Seoul Metroplex looked like a lunar landscape of craters and twisted metal. When our troops landed, we expected to find ruins and surrender," Vex Thul continued. "At worst, scattered survivors hiding in basement shelters, ready to beg for mercy. Instead, they found Captain Seung-ho and the Seoul Defense Corps waiting in prepared positions throughout the devastated city. The orbital bombardment had been anticipated, even welcomed. While the Corvani had been destroying empty buildings and abandoned bases, 40 million civilians had been evacuated through subway tunnels that had been converted into underground highways, leading to vast shelter complexes carved deep into the Earth's bedrock. The city itself had been transformed into the largest fortress in human history. Every remaining building was a disguised bunker with reinforced walls and hidden weapon emplacements. Every street was a carefully designed kill zone with overlapping fields of fire. Every intersection was mined with explosives powerful enough to destroy Corvani heavy armor. Every building was a bunker. Vex Thul's voice grew hollow as he remembered the nightmare of urban combat that followed. Every street was a kill zone. Every intersection was mined with explosives that could take out our heavy armor. And the humans fought like demons possessed. The first day of ground combat was a massacre, but not the one the Corvani had expected. Lieutenant Eunbi, a former city engineer who knew every maintenance tunnel and service corridor in Seoul, led specialized urban warfare teams through the underground network. They would strike at Corvani supply convoys from storm drains, eliminate entire patrols through subway platforms, then vanish back into the tunnels before reinforcements could arrive. Sergeant Won Ho had performed perhaps the most remarkable feat of the entire war, organizing civilian volunteers into effective fighting units. Teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, people who had never held weapons before, were formed into squads equipped with captured Corvani energy rifles and improvised explosives. They fought with the desperation of people defending their homes and the tactical awareness of soldiers who had studied their enemies' weaknesses. The civilians were the worst part, Vex Thul admitted, his mandibles clicking with distress. Our troops were trained to fight soldiers, not grandmothers with plasma grenades or children who could assemble explosive devices from household chemicals. Every human was a potential threat. But the real terror began when engineer Yu Jin completed her secret project in the underground factories that had been hidden beneath Seoul for months. Working with salvaged Corvani technology and human innovation, she had created something the defenders called the Equalizer, a weapon that turned Earth's own gravity into a devastating force. It was elegant in its simplicity, Vex Thul admitted, with grudging respect. A gravity bomb that could collapse entire city blocks by manipulating local gravitational fields. The humans had turned their own planet's physics into a weapon. The first equalizer was deployed when Colonel Moonsik found his defensive position overrun by Corvani mechanized infantry. Instead of retreating, he triggered the device in the heart of the enemy formation. The weapon created a localized gravity, while that pulled everything within a 2-kilometer radius toward a single point with irresistible force. Corvani battle tanks, troop transports and soldiers were compressed into a sphere of twisted metal and organic matter, no larger than a building. The crater left behind was perfectly spherical, as if some cosmic force had simply scooped a piece of Sol out of existence. An entire division of elite Corvani troops, 10,000 soldiers and their equipment, had been eliminated in seconds. "That's when we realized the truth," Vexthul said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't fighting an army. We weren't even fighting a government or a military force. We were fighting an entire species that had decided to die rather than surrender, and they were very, very good at taking their enemies with them. The Sol offensive became a grinding nightmare of urban warfare that lasted 2 weeks. Every street was contested. Every building was a fortress. Every intersection was a potential tomb for Corvani soldiers who had conquered dozens of worlds but had never faced an enemy like humanity. The humans used tactics that defied military logic. They would abandon perfectly defensible positions only to counterattack from unexpected directions. They turned their own city's infrastructure into weapons, flooding subway tunnels to drown Corvani troops, collapsing buildings to create avalanches of debris, even weaponizing the city's automated systems to deliver explosive packages disguised as supply drops. By the end of the 2 weeks, the Corvani had technically captured Sol Metroplex. They held the smoking ruins of what had once been humanity's greatest city. But the cost had been staggering: 50,000 soldiers dead, hundreds of vehicles destroyed, and 3 of their 5 dreadnoughts damaged by surface-launched gravity. Bombs, more importantly. They had lost something that no military force can survive without: their reputation for invincibility. Word of the Sol offensive spread throughout the galaxy, carried by survivors who spoke in hushed tones about humans who fought on with broken bodies, about civilians who chose death over surrender, about a species that seemed to grow stronger. The more desperate their situation became. The Corvani Empire had won the battle for Sol, but in doing so, they had lost something far more valuable: the fear that had made their conquests possible. And in the underground factories of Earth, human engineers were already working on new weapons, new tactics, new ways to turn their enemies' strength against them. The ruins of Sol still smoldered when the Corvani High Command convened their final war council. The chamber was filled with the bitter silence of a military that had never tasted defeat until they encountered humanity. Generals who had conquered star systems sat in stunned disbelief, staring at casualty reports that defied everything they thought they knew about warfare. "The war should have ended there," Vexthul told the tribunal, his voice heavy with the weight of hindsight. "Any sane species would have withdrawn after Sol. We had lost more soldiers in 2 weeks of urban combat than in 20 years of galactic conquest." But High Command was convinced that one final push would break human resistance. The Emperor himself had demanded total victory. The very idea that a primitive species could resist the Corvani Empire was an insult that could not be tolerated. If humans would not surrender, if they would not accept their place as subjects of the Empire, then they would be eliminated entirely. The plan that emerged from those desperate war councils was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its simplicity. Destroy Earth entirely. Turn humanity's blue-green homeworld into nothing but asteroids and cosmic dust. End the war through complete genocide. The Corvani Death Fleet was assembled in the deepest military shipyards of the Empire, where weapons too terrible for conventional warfare were built and stored. These were not ships designed for conquest or occupation. They were instruments of total annihilation, planet killers that could crack worlds like eggs and scatter their remains across the void. Admiral Huchtel, the most ruthless commander in Corvani history, was given command of this ultimate armada. He had personally overseen the extinction of 3 species during the Empire's expansion, earning him the title Worldbreaker among his peers. If anyone could end the human problem permanently, it was him. 50 dreadnoughts made up the core of the Death Fleet, each one equipped with tectonic resonance weapons that could destabilize a planet's core. Support vessels carried antimatter, bombs capable of igniting atmospheres, and orbital bombardment platforms that could sterilize continents in minutes. The assembled firepower was enough to destroy a dozen worlds, all focused on a single blue marble in an insignificant star system. It was the most powerful armada ever assembled by the Corvani Empire, Vexthul recalled. Ships that had never been defeated, weapons that had never failed to crack a world's defenses. Admiral Hyuktel was so confident that he broadcast our approach to human space, wanting them to see their doom coming. But humanity had one final surprise waiting in the darkness between the stars. As the Death Fleet approached the edge of the Sol system, they were met by a single human vessel, the Earth defense ship Unity. Captain Dongwook's ship was a converted exploration vessel, barely 1/10 the size of the smallest Corvani destroyer. So against the assembled might of 50 dreadnoughts, it looked like a minnow facing a school of sharks. "I remember his words exactly," Vexthul said, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. Captain Dongwook opened communications as if he were greeting old friends. He looked directly into our cameras with calm, steady eyes and said, "You came here to destroy our world. Instead, you're going to witness why humans have survived every catastrophe this universe has thrown at us." The Unity began broadcasting on all frequencies, but it wasn't a surrender or a plea for mercy. It was a countdown, transmitted in every language used by every species in the galaxy. As the numbers ticked down from 100, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the solar system. Behind the Unity, more human ships emerged from hidden positions where they had been waiting for months. They rose from asteroid, mining stations, from the dark side of Jupiter's moons, from concealed bases built into the rings of Saturn. They had been invisible to Corvani sensors, using stealth technology reverse-engineered from captured alien vessels and improved with human innovation. Admiral Mi-kyung led the asteroid fleet, massive mining ships that had been converted into kinetic weapons platforms. Their cargo holds were filled not with ore, but with guided projectiles that could punch through any armor ever devised. Commander Hyon Woo commanded the Shadow Squadron, stealth fighters that had been tracking the Death Fleet since it entered human space, learning its formation patterns and identifying weak points in its defenses. Lieutenant Nam Jin piloted a prototype vessel, powered by technology that shouldn't have existed, a fusion reactor that used Corvani antimatter containment principles, but generated 3 times more power than the original design. The human engineers had taken alien technology and made it better, deadlier, more efficient. But the real terror was Captain Dongwook's final message, Vexthul continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He told us that humans had spent the entire war preparing for this moment. Every battle, every defeat, every victory had taught them something new about Corvani technology, and they had used that knowledge to build something we never expected. The Unity launched its payload, but it wasn't conventional weapons or explosives. Programmer Su-min had created the most sophisticated computer virus ever developed, specifically designed to target Corvani ship systems. The virus spread through the Death Fleet's communication networks like wildfire, exploiting security flaws that the aliens never knew existed. Within minutes, half the Death Fleet was flying blind. Navigation systems crashed, weapon targeting went offline, and life support systems began failing throughout the Armada. Ships that had seemed invincible moments before were now helpless metal hulks drifting in space. Then the humans did something. "That still haunts my dreams," Vexthul whispered, his 6 eyes reflecting the trauma of that day. "They began ramming our ships. Not random kamikaze attacks driven by desperation, but precisely calculated collisions designed to cause maximum damage to our remaining vessels." Commander Jae-sung led the first ramming wave, his fighter squadron targeting the Death Fleet's command ships with surgical precision. Each pilot had studied the schematics of Corvani vessels, identifying the exact points where a small ship could cause catastrophic damage to a much larger one. They struck reactor housings, weapon storage, base command centers, turning their own lives into guided weapons that no defense could stop. Captain Young-soo followed with a wing of converted bombers, each one loaded with enough explosives to cripple a dreadnought. The pilots were all volunteers who had lost family members in previous battles, men and women who knew they wouldn't survive the mission, but wanted to ensure their deaths counted for something. The precision was inhuman, Vexthul remembered. Each ramming attack hit exactly where it needed to cause maximum damage. They weren't dying in vain. They were executing a battle plan that turned their sacrifice into ultimate victory. The Battle of Sol lasted only 30 minutes, but those 30 minutes changed the course of galactic history. The most powerful fleet ever assembled by the Corvani Empire was reduced to drifting wreckage and expanding clouds of vaporized metal. Admiral Hyuk-tel himself died when Captain Dong-wook rammed the Unity directly into the flagship's bridge, both commanders meeting their end in a ball of superheated plasma that could be seen from Earth. And the humans, Vexthul's voice cracked with emotion. They had smiled as they died, every single one of them smiled, as they rammed their ships into ours. In their final moments, as their ships broke apart around them, they were smiling, the key. Interviewer leaned forward, sensing that the story was reaching its climax. What happened next? We surrendered, Vexthul said simply, the words carrying the weight of an empire's defeat. Not because we couldn't continue fighting, but because we finally understood what we were facing. Humans don't just fight for victory. They fight for the right to exist, and they will pay any price, make any sacrifice to protect that right. He paused, his 6 eyes focusing on something far beyond the interview chamber, seeing not the sterile tribunal room, but the wreckage of the Death Fleet drifting in the cold vacuum of space. The Corvani Empire learned that day why humans have no natural predators. It's not because they're the strongest or the fastest or the smartest species in the galaxy. It's because when threatened with extinction, they become the most dangerous force in the universe. They become willing to drag their enemies into oblivion with them. The recording device clicked off with a soft electronic chirp. In the silence that followed, broken only by the hum of the tribunal's life support systems, Vexthul added one final observation that would echo through galactic history. We thought we were the apex predators of this galaxy. We believed our technology, our numbers, our military might made us unstoppable. The humans taught us that we were just another species that hadn't yet learned to fear the dark. And in that darkness, in the cold void between the stars, humanity was waiting. The interview was over, but the legend had just begun. Across the galaxy, species that had never heard of Earth began to whisper stories of the blue world whose children had broken an empire. And in the depths of space, human ships continued their journey to the stars, carrying with them the knowledge that they had earned their place in the universe not through conquest, but through the courage to defend what they could not bear to lose. The end.